Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our first of the fall semester 2024 Simon Quick Takes. For those of you who are new to the Quick Takes, these are based off of our Dean's Corner blog, where we write about either our research or our economic and business news that we think are important to comment on. So one of the things that I have been observing, and I'm sure you have been, is that what's happening in the economy is, of course, definitely a focus of mine. And with the election now, only 8 weeks left in the election, the economy and new policies, or where the candidates are and what kind of policies that they are proposing is. And the talks around kind of economic performance has been again another focal point. But something that we've been observing, not just over the last few months as we gear up to the election, but something that has been actually going on now for almost 2 years. There's a disconnect between what we see in macroeconomic activity versus how the consumers are feeling. Now, it's hard to elicit consumers' feelings. There are different ways that we survey. There are 2 surveys, one done by the Conference Board, another one done by the University of Michigan, where they ask consumers about everything from their employment prospects to their own finances and their take on the economy, and try to chart some sort of a sentiment. And as you can see, the Consumer Sentiment Index, which can be divided into current conditions and future expectations, those are the 3 different lines that you're seeing there, has understandably gone down during COVID. That was a big epidemic that most of us had not ever lived through such a thing before, but has really not recovered. And there's just an economic pessimism and malaise that is permeating a lot of the discussions that we hear, and a lot of the kind of the feedback from the consumers. So what is really what we're thinking about? Where is the disconnect? On the one hand, economic growth in the United States, and especially a very booming, tight labor market for much of the recovery, these were remarkable comeback stories. We really didn't have this kind of comeback in most of the industrialized nations. They certainly recovered to a large extent as well, but the US was almost kind of unique in its ability and speed of recovery. And as we even look ahead, the US is poised to grow about 2 times of any G7 country, according to IMF estimates. We're consistently getting low unemployment and relatively tight labor market indicators. Yet, when surveyed, 56% of the Americans think US is in a recession. It is not. 49% think that S&P 500 is down for the year. It's actually up more than 12%. So what is the voter pessimism? Where is it coming from? What is the source of this voter pessimism? It's easy to dismiss and say, oh, maybe they're not looking at the right information, maybe there's distorted information, but we would like to dig a little bit deeper in and look at what the average voter or the average consumer is facing in the economy. So let's talk about 4 reasons for pessimism. On the one hand, we have housing prices that are quite high still, and we have a low supply. The rate on 30-year mortgages are up 4 percentage points. You can see that, if you look at the mortgage indices anywhere, since 2021. That's a significant increase after especially a couple of decades of relatively low interest rates. House prices are up 6.5% compared to past year. And here is the Case-Shiller US National Home Price Index. You can see that, there's some dips that we observed that are not very large, but all in all, a very large increase in house prices, especially compared to sort of 2012 or so. Normally, when we see mortgage interest rates go up significantly, we would see a price slowdown, or even maybe the nominal prices coming down, but that's just not happening in the housing market. After a decade of underbuilding, there's some estimates out there that we're missing about 4 million homes in the US economy. So While inflation came down at the same time, shelter prices, this is what folks pay in terms of rent and so on, have been really sluggish in adjusting down. So it's been persistently high. So when you're a wannabe homeowner or a renter, these are not great numbers to look at. And you can see why it's been difficult for households to try to break into home ownership, and then in the meantime, pay relatively high shelter or rental and other housing prices as well. So that's one. What's the second one? We're seeing some elevated mortgage and auto delinquency rates. Both of these rates that are tracked have increased in the Q1 of 2024. Now, they haven't increased to a point that alarm bells should ring, especially on the mortgage default rate, but 7.9% of all auto loans have now transitioned to delinquency. This is higher than the pre-pandemic levels. That's not the only way where car owners are feeling a pinch. Full coverage car insurance rose 26% over the last year. It is now $2,543 for national average, that is, to get car insurance. And so when you look at that, yes, used cars sales that were really hit during COVID, and their prices shot up during COVID. It was very difficult to find any cars on the lot of dealerships, not just new cars, but even used cars and trucks. That's what led to a very large increase in prices. Those prices have come down, not to the index of the level that we have experienced pre-pandemic, but at the same time, these sort of auxiliary expenses that come with car ownership have dramatically increased as well. So it's not a terrible surprise to see these kinds of delinquency rates starts to rise. Higher grocery and childcare prices. Grocery prices are up 25% over 4 years. That's relative, a 6 percentage points higher relative to the inflation during this period of time. So even when we have high or low inflation, we want prices of different things to rise at the same rate. That way, we don't have what we call relative price distortion, right? Here, we're really seeing a relative price distortion where grocery prices are up higher than the average inflation rate. The average family spent 32% more in childcare in January 2024 relative to January 2019. Again, during that period of time, we're talking about a 19% roughly inflation rate. That is significantly higher, not quite double, but significantly higher than the inflation rate that we have experienced across the US economy. So think about yourself as having been a relatively young family who are renting and who would like to have maybe some home ownership and who have cars and who are going to the grocery store to feed your families. And at the same time, maybe 1 or 2 working professionals who are buying childcare. Those families are starting to and have been feeling quite the pinch. The wages haven't risen at this rate. Although they have risen, they certainly haven't risen at the rate of inflation during this time, which means that purchasing power or real wages have actually come down. And we see some of that evidence because you can see this sort of shift from 2019 to 2024 of households that have, different earnings. You have the households that earn more than 50K. You have the households that earn between 50K and 100K. And then you have the households that have more than 100K. Well, those households, the high earners, are paying a lot more in childcare. The 50K to 100K, they're probably making some substitutions during this time, still earning some money, but maybe finding other childcare. And the folks who are earning less than 50K, it's, we have to be careful about how we interpret the causality in this graph, but it certainly has led to a decrease. What we are at least observing is a decrease in childcare payments, because prices have gone up possibly so much that they have decided to sort of roll back the amount of childcare that they're buying. So that's where the consumers are certainly feeling some of these pinches. So, and one other thing, well, you can ask, what happened to the stimuli money that we gave? You know, we had the 2020 CARES Act, we have the American Rescue Plan Act a year following that. That injected about $4 trillion into the US economy. During the period of 2020 and 2022, Americans built up 2.7 trillion in savings. I mean, that's remarkable because American consumers are not the biggest savers in the world. We actually tend to have, as consumers, pretty much a negative savings rate on average. So that was a significant savings rate. But when we look at sort of what has happened to that savings right now, for 60% of these households who benefited or who have increased their savings, the war chest is empty. And when you ask about sort of, you know, where did that COVID sort of, you know, pre-COVID and post-COVID kind of savings have gone, 59% have answered that they have mostly depleted their excess savings. There's, you know, the 41% haven't touched most of it all. And when you ask about for those who have depleted or used up that savings, where has it really gone? And you look at it and you see that there's definitely a lot of it going towards bills and essentials, and some of it, of course, to surprise emergency costs. But there are some folks who did actually have some expensive purchases as well. But that war chest is gone. So when you add up all of these 4 different things, and there are many, many things we could have explored, but we only have about 20 minutes to go through some of the salient points here, is that you can begin to see where the consumers are certainly feeling a pinch. And that malaise, that kind of doom gloomish or you know, pessimism does have some certainly factual basis in what's happening to their budgets. But it's not all doom and gloom. So let's think about some reasons for optimism. And I'm not suggesting at all that what I'm about to show you affects all households equally. That's one of going to be the takeaways when we reach the end of our 20 minutes. But Americans are actually, in terms of financing that debt, any debt that they might have, whether that's total debt or mortgage debt, they have historically some of the lowest debt burdens that they have ever seen, meaning that Americans spending record low percentage of their disposable income on debt. Debt payments are about 9.8% of disposable income. Here on the left-hand side over here, I've plotted from Fred what that percentage is. The average, long-term average, was about 11%. We're seeing that the households are actually spending a lot less of their disposable income, even after that income injection from the stimulus money has gone away. So that's at a historically low level. Now you might think, well, how does that square away with what you just told us? You told us that mortgage rates were up 4 percentage points. And housing prices were high. So people were getting higher mortgages, probably at a higher rate. How is that congruent with what you have just told us? Well, that's the divide, right? Those people who possibly had already a mortgage, we saw an incredible refinancing boom in 2020, 2021, when interest rates were quite low. 14 million homeowners refinanced and locked in a low rate. So existing homeowners who especially had the ability to refinance, they are seeing a very good debt to income ratio. And it's not just mortgage debt, and you're seeing that on the right-hand side, lower point here, that's also a percentage of disposable income, not only below the historical averages that I'm showing you here, but at an all-time low, okay? And that translates into relatively larger total debt burden as well. We still have a pretty low unemployment rate. It's very easy to kind of look at the headlines in the newspapers. And again, you know, sometimes dramatic stories sell a lot more newspapers, get a lot more clicks than sort of, hey, everything is chugging along fine. I understand that that particular incentive. But even when we see a little bit of fluctuations in the labor market, now people are talking about, oh, we didn't create as many jobs in the last 3 months. The latest number that came in was about 140,000 in the month of July. Month of August, rather than the 160 we expected, or the 200, 300s, 400s, 500s we saw in post-COVID time. But unemployment rate is still historically very low. the August number came in at about 4.2%, and there's that remarkable recovery during right after the aftermath of the intense period of COVID. This is a remarkable story that we have this, of course, everything shut down. We remember, perhaps we want to certainly erase it from some of our collective memory. But then the recovery was quite, especially a big chunk of the recovery happened very quickly. And then the rest of it took a little bit more time, especially services sectors took a little bit more time to recover. But we're at a historically low unemployment number. You can say, well, people got discouraged and they went home and they're not even looking for a job. And that's why you're seeing unemployment numbers, because you only count the people who are actively looking for a job and don't have a job in the unemployment rate, not the folks that we say are discouraged workers or not in the labor force. I mean, who's doing all of this childcare that people can't afford? Somebody in the family is probably, stopped going to work and started more of this childcare. That's certainly true. But here's another number to share. Missing workers are back. So no, we don't have a lot of people relative to where we were before pre-COVID not in the labor force. And those missing workers are back. US prime age workers, 25 to 54, the participation rate remains at its highest level in 2 decades. Just to give you an idea, the participation rate in the United States increased very high, for quite a while. That was a lot of women and minorities entering into the workforce. The men, if we just look at men, that had been declining actually since World War II, because the participation rates at that time was about above 90%. We certainly want some of our, especially young males, to continue to going to school and get that kind of important skills. I have to say that as a professor and as a higher education professional. But then it sort of leveled off. And that decline in participation rate that you're seeing, that trend that you're seeing overall has been there since 2000. That's a structural change that had been happening. Of course, the participation rate declined heavily, a few percentage points during COVID, but then has been recovering. And we're not only back to where that trend was, we're sort of a little bit even above the trend decline that we had been seeing. So missing workers are back. And you know who's really back? More than 70% of prime age women are currently employed, an all-time high. So these are really actually great numbers for us to be able to point to in the labor market, but in terms of sort of households' ability to weather any storm that might be coming as well. Inflation, largely under control. This is the 12-month percent change that were from the August numbers that just came out not too long ago, less than a week ago. And what are we seeing here? Well, these are, first of all, let me just explain here, we're a little bit above 2%. The Fed's kind of target rate tends to be, or has been historically, over the last couple of decades, about 2%. We're a smidge above that. We didn't quite come down to 2%, but we're very close. Food prices are up about 2%. Energy, after especially kind of the big energy price increases with, Russian-Ukraine war, energy prices actually have been coming down. But when we look at sort of all items less food and energy, right, what would that be? Well, I just told you about sort of where childcare is going. I just told you about where insurance is going, not just home car insurance, but also home insurance. There are lots of different places. Eating out has become extremely expensive because not only wages are up, but also, shelter or rent is up. So there's a lot of different things that are hitting the budgets of the consumers, certainly. But inflation is largely under control. And that will, of course, lead the Fed to possibly start kind of turning their interest rate policy around and start maybe seeing starting with the next meeting, start seeing some decreases in the federal funds rate. So those are some good stories, but what's the bottom line? The malaise, not entirely unfounded. Although sometimes misguided about cause or sometimes even effect. S&P 500 is not down. We're not in a recession. But you can see kind of the 4 items that I have put on here where the average household is feeling a pinch. Americans have been experiencing, that's always been somewhat true, but certainly during this recovery period have been experiencing the same economy in vastly different ways. I made the contrast between the existing homeowners versus those who want to become homeowners, those who rely on childcare, those who don't, and so on and so forth. Real wages have not kept up with inflation. So although we have seen wage growth, it's not kept up with inflation, which means that purchasing power, or as we call it, real wages, have actually come down, specifically affecting households with car payments, shelter, childcare, and groceries as a large part of the budget. So we hope to be able to see the presidential candidates have some policy solutions and make that a big part of their platform to address these issues, because there's a very large group of voters out there who are tuning in to see what those solutions would be and how they could be resolved. So I'll stop there and open it up for Q&A. Okay, let me just make sure that I do have the Q&A set up here. Is there a way to evaluate the quality of the jobs and wages in the current market beyond total unemployment rate? I mean, of course, you know, we have a lot of different measures. I wish I had the time to be able to give you a full primer on how we think about the labor market. We divide it by different demographics of the labor force. We divide it by different sectors. We divide it by tasks. There's a million different ways that we slice and look at the data. So absolutely, some aggregate numbers. When we say the economic growth is good, that's hiding a lot of things. Like that's a big headline aggregate number that doesn't say anything about, well, how evenly is it distributed? It's the same thing with unemployment. When we look at unemployment, the one thing I will say about unemployment before I move on to the next question is that one of the things that we did see during this recovery, post-pandemic reason, is that actually the inequality, demographically speaking, in the unemployment rate, if you look at the unemployment rate in demographics in the United States, typically young Black males had the highest unemployment rates. Especially if by young, I mean, we're looking at kind of 18 to 25, okay, had always. And women also typically had higher, especially women of color. So what we have seen is that when we look across the inequality in unemployment rates in a demographic sense, that inequality has actually come down. Part of it has to do with the fact that if you look at sort of women, especially women with small children at home, or perhaps even other family members that they're responsible for taking care of, the hybrid or remote work has actually allowed them to return to the workforce or continue to be engaged in the workforce. And that has been a positive boost. So there are a lot of various layers. Hopefully we can do a SQT assignment quick takes just on that topic. Please comment on the effect on retirees. The post-war baby boomers are still a large demographic. Absolutely. And part of what you were seeing in that labor participation rate after 2000 that I was showing you, that's kind of structural decline in the labor participation rate is starting to have to do with kind of the retirees as well. We do have the baby boomer generation starting to retire, and that's going to change the labor. It's been changing the labor dynamics. That's been changing what it means for Social Security. That's changing, especially the biggest impact, honestly, and maybe we should do another SQT on that one, is about the healthcare costs and healthcare burden. So a lot of expenses, a lot of different things going on because our life expectancy has grown, and now we have this larger population of folks starting to retire as well. Has the repeatedly efforts by Trump to say that the things are bad in America contributing to the sentiment that things are not good as they never say? Look, we have a lot of things going on. I mean, we have seen a couple of wars over the last couple of years, that are have been continuing, and the human toll, the financial toll, the physical capital toll, and especially the human toll. So it's not, I mean, I'm sure all of you have experienced days when you don't want to even look at the news because it just seemed like one bad news after another, if not happening inside of the United States, certainly globally. There's a lot of tensions. There's a lot of anticipation and anxiety around elections. It's not only elections happening here, elections are happening in Europe, in Asia. So all of that is contributing to that possibly anxiety level. But, you know, I'm an economist, so I can only look at it from the kind of the economic data that I see, and not sort of the psychology of it. But, you know, but we are also seeing that there are some economic data, and that's the bottom line. There is some economic data, leaving the psyche aside, economic data that is definitely giving that feeling of that supports why consumers are feeling the pinch and have a little bit of a pessimistic outlook. I see that you've used CPI as a key benchmark, but what about PCE? There are lots of benchmarks. I actually showed you both the all food items as well as all items minus the you know, energy and food. There are different ways we can look at different price indices, and the Federal Reserve actually doesn't look at the headline CPI. It looks at kind of the core inflation. So there are lots of different ways to look at it, but all of them have been trending down, and that's the kind of the takeaway. Is there typically a lag in the recovery of real wages once inflation is under control? No, we can't say that, you know, that. I think what you might be asking is whether there's real wages, you know, are just sort of adjusting. Certainly there's a lag, right? When you think about sort of how you set, or how even we set wages and salaries at the university, those are usually done kind of on an annual basis, right? You get your, you know, beginning of the fiscal year, you get your new salary letter, and you're kind of making, you know, those adjustments. If there is an adjustment associated with inflation, those adjustments are made off of sort of realized inflation. And but I'm stuck with that salary, or people are stuck with that particular deduction, or, you know, the tax deduction, or COLA, like Social Security checks and so on and so forth, for a year. If during the course of that year's realized inflation is higher than what the adjustment had been, there's certainly going to be a hit. So there is that lag, absolutely. But that's why I was trying to give more of a sort of like a 4-year average, 5-year average, rather than looking at an annual basis. So we are not really seeing the real wages kind of be, you know, rise. We've certainly seen them decrease. So it's not catching up, and it's not clear to me that it will catch up. Do I expect the target rate cuts from the Fed materially to change pessimism? You know, certainly some of these pinches, right, whether it's about the variable interest rates some of the mortgage holders are seeing, whether that's about the credit card debt, whether that's about the variable auto loan rate, whatever it is, I think that's going to certainly go in the right direction of some of the items that I have identified in terms of the pessimism if we do see a interest rate cut. But in terms of sort of what will happen to food prices, what will happen to childcare prices, well, I mean, one thing that we do fear is that if we do go a little aggressively in the interest rate cuts, that we might actually have inflation rear its ugly head again. So it's a balance, it's a trade-off. You know, you've heard that a lot from economists, because unfortunately our world is never black and white. There's a lot of trade-offs and a lot of sort of, you know, it's a whack-a-mole. You hit it on one side, pops out on the other hand. Okay. I think I am at my time. I can see that there's quite a few questions still remaining. I really thank you for your engagement. I hope this was a well-spent half an hour. It's always great to hear the questions and engage with you this way, and we'll continue to watch how the economy and how the election unfolds. So please register for getting the Dean's blog, you know, so that way when a new item is posted, and they're made for general audience, so you don't have to have expertise in the areas that we post about. That way you can get a notification that a new article is up, and we'll continue to do these SQTs, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.